On the evening of November 12, 1996, the sky over India looked calm as usual. Where the day turned to a velvety blue, where the voices of the streets subsided and the first lanterns were lit, everything went on as usual. But in seconds, this harmony will turn into chaos. At an altitude of about 4 kilometers, not far from the city of Charkhi Dadri, a glow suddenly flashed with such force that it was mistaken for a bomb explosion or a meteorite fall. People on Earth saw a huge fiery flower blooming in the clear sky, and its petals, flaming fragments of metal, falling down. The crew of the American military transport Starlifter, which was traveling one echelon below, was the first to notice the disaster. The co-pilot, barely recovering from what he saw, got in touch and said, "Something happened to our right. A huge fireball. A big explosion. I see falling debris." His voice was flat, but there was that same surprise in it when a person realizes that he has just witnessed something absolutely incredible. The contrast was striking. A moment ago, the radio broadcast resembled calm sea surf, clear altitude reports, standard dispatcher responses, confident pilots' voices. Everything went according to the rules, and the rules in aviation are almost a law of nature. But suddenly this steady rhythm stopped. Only fragments remained on the air, tense lines, unintelligible screams and a prayer in Arabic, uttered, perhaps, in the very last seconds. And then, dead silence. The silence that was felt especially acutely on Earth. In villages and on the outskirts of Delhi, people ran out of their homes, looked up and saw thousands of burning fragments streaking across the sky like red-hot arrows. Metal, which until recently had been part of the most complex machines, was now falling to the ground, leaving long smoky trails in its wake. But it wasn't a meteorite or a military test. These were two passenger planes, symbols of human progress and comfort, the pinnacle of engineering. Two liners, each with its own destiny and its own route, met where they should not have met. An accidental gust of wind did not bring them together. It wasn't an engine malfunction or a sudden lightning strike. It was the result of a chain of human decisions, mistakes, and misunderstandings that came together at one fateful point. The fireball over India has become a symbol of how fragile the balance in the sky is. Where accuracy is measured in seconds and hundreds of meters, the slightest mistake turns into a disaster. To understand why this happened, you need to reconstruct the entire path step by step. From the moment when the Il-76 rises into the skies of Kazakhstan, to the moment when the giant Boeing of the Saudi airline takes off towards it. Their trajectories should have passed side by side, but not crossed. And yet they came together in one line. It was here, in the night sky above Charkhi Dadri, at the moment when the flaming debris fell to the ground, that one story ended and another began, the story of investigation, reforms and new rules, already written in blood. A few hours before the tragedy in Shymkent, Kazakhstan, the Il-76 was preparing to take off. This aircraft is not a luxury liner, but a huge military transport giant designed to transport equipment, cargo and soldiers. But in the 90s, he often took on board passengers, ordinary people, specialists, and families. 27 passengers and 10 crew members were accommodated on its deck. The Il-76 was like a symbol of the post-Soviet era, harsh, heavy, converted to the needs of private airlines. There were experienced pilots in the cockpit, among them Commander Alexander Cherpaninov, co-pilot Ermek Janjarov, navigator, flight engineer and flight attendant. They had hundreds of flight hours under their belt, but there was a flight ahead in which it was the small details, the human factor and misunderstandings that would play a fatal role. On the same day, thousands of kilometers from Shymkent, another plane was preparing to take off in the Indian capital Delhi, the opposite of the Kazakh truck. The Boeing 747, the pride of the world's civil aviation, is nicknamed the Jumbo Jet. It was filled with passengers, 312 people on board, families with children, pilgrims, business people. They were all on their way to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. The contrast of the two cars was striking. On the one hand, there was a heavy Illinois Il-76, where some of the passengers were sitting directly on the cargo deck, next to fasteners and metal partitions. On the other hand, there was a comfortable Boeing, a double-deck liner, a symbol of convenience and scale, with seats, service, and portholes through which the Indian night horizon opened. Their routes seemed far apart. One was heading to Delhi, the other was leaving it. But the air is not endless, it is divided into invisible air corridors. And it is one of them, the G452 highway, that will become their meeting point. In aviation, these corridors operate as strictly as railway tracks. Each flight gets its own train, the altitude at which it should go. There are hundreds of meters of difference between the echelons, which ensure safety. The Illinois Il-76 was traveling at level 330, that is, 33,000 feet, but the dispatcher allowed it to descend to level 150. The Boeing 747, which took off from Delhi, was gaining altitude and was already at level 140. According to the scheme, everything looked perfect. One descends from above, the other goes from below, and there is a safe distance between them. On paper, it's security. In reality, there is a fine line where any deviation could lead to disaster. The two planes were moving towards each other at a speed of over 800 km per hour each. In sum, this meant that the distance between them was shrinking at the speed of a bullet. On the ground, it seemed that they were safe, because the trains were separated. But what the pilots didn't know yet was that on this particular evening, a mistaken perception, a misunderstanding of English, and a few seconds of hesitation would make their trajectories deadly close. They were flying towards each other, but so far no one suspected it. The weather in Shymkent was cool that November day. At the airfield surrounded by the steppe, a huge Illinois Il-76 was preparing to take off. From the outside, this aircraft looked impressive, for massive engines, a high keel stabilizer, and a cargo hatch, like the gateway to an entire hangar. To the uninitiated, the silt seemed like a machine designed for war or transporting tanks, and it was close to the truth. But in the 90s, such planes began to earn extra money for peaceful purposes, transporting people on charter routes when there were not enough conventional airliners. There were only 27 passengers on board that day. Among them are technicians and engineers who were supposed to maintain the plane on the ground in Delhi, several business people, as well as random passengers who bought tickets for this flight. They did not sit in comfortable armchairs with individual portholes, but directly on the cargo deck, where the seats were installed along the sides. Metal walls, the smell of aviation kerosene and the hum of running systems, the atmosphere here was far from the comfort of Boeing and Airbus. But then it was considered normal, a cheap ticket in exchange for a minimum of amenities. Ahead, in the cockpit, were experienced aviators. Commander Alexander Cherpaninov is a man who went through the Soviet school, accustomed to strict discipline and strict rules. The co-pilot Ermak Janjarov drove the car confidently, but all the responsibility still lay with the commander. The navigator monitored the route, the flight engineer controlled the power plant, and the flight attendant kept in touch with the dispatchers, a separate position that had almost disappeared on Western aircraft in the 90s. Soviet airliners had a two-story cabin, the pilots were on top, and the navigator and radio operator's workplace were on the bottom. This disconnect sometimes led to information being lost along the way, and this would play a role later. Meanwhile, in Delhi, thousands of kilometers away, a huge international airport was bustling with life. A Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 was preparing for takeoff there, a real king of the sky, nicknamed the Jumbo Jet. There were 312 passengers on board. For many of them, this flight was part of a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, for others it was the beginning of a business trip or return home. The atmosphere in the cabin was completely different. The double-deck liner offered comfort, upholstered chairs, hot meals, and the opportunity to look out the window at the twinkling lights of the Indian capital. If the Illinois 76 was a harsh giant created for work, then the Boeing 747 was the embodiment of the dream of mass air travel. Its engines roared as it pulled away from the runway, lifting hundreds of people into the air. There were also professionals in the cabin of the Jumbo, but their working conditions were much more comfortable: modern devices, a well-established communication system, and a spacious workplace. Still, both planes had one thing in common: they entered an airspace where order was maintained by invisible lines on maps. Airways like the G-452 resembled highways, only in the sky. The planes followed them strictly, echelon by echelon, like a floor-by-floor parking lot, where everyone has their own place. The Illinois 76 was heading to Delhi, the Boeing 747 was leaving it. It would seem that the ideal system is: one is descending, the other is gaining altitude, and there is always a guaranteed hundreds of meters difference between them. But the reality was much more vulnerable. The Delhi air traffic controllers did not have the equipment that would allow them to see the real height of the planes. They only knew what the crews themselves reported. One misspoken train, one erroneous confirmation, could turn these parallel lines into an intersection point. The Illinois 76 was coming from the north at that moment, descending towards Delhi. The Boeing 747 was rising into the sky, heading west. They were only a few thousand meters apart, and every second that distance was shrinking. If someone looked at the radar, they would see two markers moving towards each other along the same line. They seemed to be separated by an invisible wall of height. But in the cockpits, the pilots did not know how close they would be. It was a regular flight for the passengers. It's another working day for the crews. It's a routine shift for dispatchers. No one suspected that these two planes were already connected by the same trajectory. Their flight had just begun, but the finale was already predetermined. In the 90s, India's airspace resembled a busy intersection of a megalopolis, only invisible. Thousands of planes crossed the skies over the country every day, connecting Europe with Asia and the Middle East. But if traffic on Earth is regulated by traffic lights and road signs, then in the sky everything is kept at echelons, altitude levels that are assigned by the dispatcher. The echelon is like a floor in a heavenly house. One plane is traveling at 33,000 feet, the other at 35, the third at 31. There are hundreds of meters of difference between them, and this is enough so that the air corridors do not intersect. In theory, such a system is flawless. In reality, it completely depends on the accuracy of the crew's reports and the attentiveness of the dispatchers. At that time, old-style radars were used in Delhi. They showed the aircraft's mark, its course, speed, approximate position. But they did not display the most important value: height. In order for the dispatcher to know exactly where the plane is vertically, the pilots had to report it themselves. Every broadcast on the radio became the only source of information. This created a paradoxical situation: the dispatcher was responsible for the safety of tens of thousands of people, but actually worked almost blindly. He could see that the two sides were heading towards each other, but he had to take the crew's word for it that they were holding their echelons. The slightest discrepancy between the report and reality turned a safe distance into a deadly rapprochement. The G-452 highway, where the Illinois 76 and the Boeing 747 met, was one of the busiest. It connected the north and south of the airspace, and dozens of planes were flying along it per hour. It was a common thing for experienced dispatchers to issue permits for recruitment and descent, coordinate movement, and maintain order. But behind that calm voice that sounded on the air, there was a constant tension. Imagine, dispatcher Shriv Kadath is sitting in front of a screen where aircraft markings are moving towards each other. He knows that the Illinois 76 should descend to level 150, and the Boeing Saudi Arabian Airlines should keep level 140. Everything seems to be safe. A difference of 1,000 feet is the standard that aviation around the world can withstand. But he has no confirmation that the mud is really at 15,000 feet. There's just a dot on the screen, and nothing else. The contrast is especially noticeable when compared with today's technology. Modern control centers have systems that show everything: the exact altitude, speed, course, even the predicted trajectory. But in 1996, this was not the case in India. Where today the numbers themselves appear on the screen, then everything depended on the words. And here lies the key vulnerability. English is an international language in aviation, and all negotiations should be conducted only in it. But for many crews from the former Soviet Union, it remained a difficult barrier. The radio broadcast often turned into a mix of accents, unheard words, and repeated requests. Any hitch in understanding could cost too much. On that day, on the G452 highway, two planes were moving towards each other, separated by only 1,000 feet. The dispatcher relied on the crew's reports. The crews relied on the dispatcher. But none of them saw the full picture. It was an invisible corridor where security existed only on paper, but in reality everything was based on the accuracy of human hearing and memory. In aviation, the radio is almost like a circulatory system. The whole life of the airspace is conveyed through short and clear phrases: who is at what altitude, where is he moving, and what maneuvers is he performing. But the effectiveness of this system is based on two things: discipline and clarity. Any inaccuracy can be fatal. On the Il-76, an on-board radio operator kept in touch with the dispatcher, a position that had already become a thing of the past in the West. On Boeings, the pilots communicated directly, but Soviet cars still had the habit of having a separate radio operator. His work seemed routine: reading out the echelons, confirming the commands, repeating the numbers. But with the language barrier, it turned into a real challenge. Igor Rep, the radio operator of the Kazakh Il-76, negotiated with the dispatcher Charkhi Dadri. The Indian spoke English with a strong accent, at a fast pace, as if in a hurry to release the ether. It was a habit for him: dozens of flights every day, a minimum of time. It's a test for Igor. English was difficult, and many phrases had to be clarified several times. In an overloaded broadcast, such repeats created chaos. When the dispatcher reported that the Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 had reached flight level 140 and should hold it, he added important information: oncoming traffic was Il-76, which was supposed to hold flight level 150. The difference is 1,000 feet. Everything is safe. But at the same moment, Igor Rep reported that their Illinois had already reached echelon 150. In fact, the plane was higher at that moment, about 16,000 feet, and continued to descend. This detail sounds subtle, but it was the beginning of the chain. The dispatcher took the crew at their word: if they report 15,000, then they are there. All he had on the screen was a dot with no height. The silt descended lower, but no one knew it. To complicate the situation even more, a human factor was added in the cockpit. The co-pilot Ermak Janjarov, who was passionate about flying in the clouds, misinterpreted the dispatcher's command. It seemed to him that the Illinois should descend to level 140. And he continued to pull their wheel down. Commander Cherpananov, who was sitting next to him, did not intervene. Maybe he didn't hear it. Perhaps he trusted a colleague. The navigator, who according to the rules was supposed to monitor the altitude, was also silent. It turned out that one person misunderstood the phrase, and the rest simply did not correct it. At that time, short disturbing fragments appeared on the air. The dispatcher warned: Kazakh 1907, oncoming traffic, Boeing 747, 10 miles away. Let me know if you see him. Radio operator Igor Rep asked me to repeat it. He did not understand at what distance the other plane was located. They repeated it to him: 8 miles. The answer was: we're looking for it now. But no one in the cockpit saw the lights of the Boeing. Clouds hid the sky. So the radio broadcast, designed to create clarity, turned into a set of understatements and mistakes. Everyone involved in the situation thought they were in control of the situation. The dispatcher was sure that the trains were separated. The Illinois 76 crew believed that they were following instructions correctly. The crew of the Boeing did not even suspect that their neighbor in the corridor was trespassing. But in reality, the two planes were heading towards each other on the same line, and they were separated by only a few hundred meters in height. The ether remained calm only in appearance. But behind those short phrases, disaster was born. The Illinois 76 was heading down through dense clouds. Delhi is below, and the entry point to the approach area is ahead. The descent was a routine procedure, but this time it unfolded too fast and too low. On the instruments, the co-pilot saw the altitude going down, 16,000 feet, 15,500, but he continued to lower the car, thinking that the dispatcher had cleared flight level 140. In aviation, such misunderstandings are called the QNH error, an error in altitude interpretation. The navigator usually notices her, but he was silent in the cockpit of the Illinois 76. Commander Chirpanov did not interfere at that moment. Perhaps he was sure that the radio operator had agreed on everything. Perhaps he was distracted by discussing the details of the approach. The autopilot continued to gently pull the car down. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Meanwhile, things were getting more alarming on the radio. The dispatcher warned, Kazakh 1907, oncoming traffic. Boeing 747 at level 140, 8 miles away. A second of silence. The radio operator replies, we're looking for it now. But no one sees the Boeing in the cockpit, the clouds hide everything. It was a special stress for the pilots. Usually, in clear weather, you can see the lights of the oncoming side for tens of kilometers. Even if the dispatcher does not see, the crew sees for themselves. But there was zero visibility here. They walked blindly, relying only on the instruments and on the words of the dispatcher. The silt continued to decline. The instrument showed 14,800 feet, 14,600. A Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 was already at flight level 140, flying towards it. The two planes were separated by a few hundred meters. Tension was building in the cabin of the Illinois 76. Someone from the crew said, "Hold the train, which train did they give us?" The answer sounded uncertain, "Hold 150, do not descend." But the car was already descending. The situation was like a slow fall into a trap, when everyone realizes that something is going wrong, but no one takes on the decisive command. At this moment, the commander finally sensed something was amiss. 20 seconds before the collision, he turned off the autopilot and ordered the flight engineer to increase the engine speed. The plane began to gain power, trying to escape upward. But there was too little time left. The invisible wall between the echelons disappeared. The Illinois 76 ended up where only the Boeing should have been. The two trajectories, calculated as parallel, converged at one point. And now it all depended on the seconds. There were less than 20 seconds left. For an outside observer, this is a moment. Time seemed to stretch out for the pilots in the cockpit of the Illinois 76. The instruments showed that the altitude was falling too fast. There should already be another plane at the level of 14,000 feet, but no one sees it. "Hold the train," one of the crew members throws nervously. The answer sounds uncertain, we're holding 150. But the arrow on the altimeter is slowly creeping down, stubbornly crossing the red border. 11 seconds before the collision, Commander Chirpanov decides to turn off the autopilot. His hand abruptly takes control. "Turn up the engine," he orders the flight engineer. 4 powerful engines begin to roar harder, as if the plane is trying to jerk up, to escape from a trap. But time is running out. 8 seconds before the meeting, the crew still can't see anything. Clouds, gray and dense, hide the sky corridor. They only know one thing: somewhere out there, ahead, there is a giant Boeing 747 flying full of people. And the trajectories should have diverged, but something went wrong. For seconds before their collision, the tension breaks out into a desperate scream. An onboard driver notices shadows and bright lights through the clouds, and shouts out in panic, "Go to the 150th, on the 140th this A." His voice breaks. Now it is clear, they are not alone in this sky. At the same moment, a different atmosphere reigned in the cockpit of the Boeing. There were no screams. The dispatcher's smooth voice sounded there: "Saudi 763, maintain level 140. The commander confirmed that they were holding altitude. For them, the flight was routine, ordinary. No one suspected that there was another plane in the clouds directly ahead. And now, a second of truth. The Illinois 76 emerges from the clouds, but it's too late. At a speed of more than 1,500 kilometers per hour, two airliners find themselves face to face. An attempt to go upstairs does not have time to save the situation. At 1841, the sky flashes over Charkhi Dadri. The huge wing of the Illinois 76 cuts into the right plane of the Boeing, cutting through it like a knife through paper. At this moment, hundreds of tons of metal turn into an uncontrollable fire vortex. For the crews, the fight ended in a split second. For observers on Earth, everything was just beginning: a flaming ball, debris falling like a meteor shower, and silence on the radio, cut only by fragments of someone else's prayer. 1841 local time. The sky over India exploded. Where a second ago there had been nothing but clouds and the usual hum of engines, a blinding explosion appeared. It was so bright that it could be seen from dozens of kilometers away. The villagers around Charkhi Dadri first heard a rumble like a thunderclap, although it was a quiet, cloudless night outside. Then the sky lit up with a flash. Many people thought about a meteorite fall, while others thought about military exercises. No one could have imagined that two passenger liners collided in the sky. Debris began to fall from the clouds. They looked like a meteor shower, burning pieces of the fuselage, fragments of wings, and parts of the cabin that had recently been filled with people. The largest fragments left behind fiery plumes, like the tails of comets. Small pieces of metal, plastic, and fabric flew through the air, covering the ground around them. Against the background of this picture, the voice from the radio sounded especially scary. On the Delhi approach frequency, words in Arabic were heard, a prayer uttered, most likely, by one of the Boeing pilots. It was the last human phrase breaking through the chaos. After that, the broadcast went silent. But the silence didn't last long. The crew of the American military transport Starlifter, which was located one echelon below, got in touch. The co-pilot said, "Did you see it? There's a big fireball to our right. It looks like a massive explosion. I see burning debris." His voice was calm, but there was a sense of shock in those words. For experienced military pilots, the sky has always been predictable, but not this evening. The picture above was no less creepy. Where two massive planes were moving a second ago, there were only hundreds of small marks, fragments that fell down. Not a single whole wing, not a single recognizable silhouette. The metal created for flying turned into a shower of sparks. On the ground, the debris was found for a long time. Some fell directly onto the fields, others destroyed the roofs of houses, piercing them like bombs. Miraculously, none of the villagers were injured, although the debris fell literally hundreds of meters from residential buildings. For the people who witnessed this disaster, time seemed to stand still. Someone was screaming, someone was standing in a daze, and someone rushed to run, thinking that another explosion was about to follow. Children hid under the awnings, while adults stared at the sky, not understanding what had happened. The tragedy seemed unreal. Passenger liners, symbols of safety and progress, were destroyed in 1 second. It was not the result of a hurricane, not a lightning strike, not a malfunction of equipment. It was the result of a collision that shouldn't have happened in principle. Within minutes, the Indian dispatchers realized that 2 tags had disappeared from their radar screens at once. The Il-76 and the Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 no longer existed as complete facilities. In their place, there was only a fire scar in the sky and a scattering of dots that were rapidly falling towards the ground. This painting will forever remain in the memory of those who saw it with their own eyes. The sky is torn apart, and the ground is strewn with debris. When the first rescue teams reached the crash area, there was no doubt, 2 planes had disappeared into the air. The wreckage was scattered for many kilometers, traces of fuel were still smoldering on the ground, but no one found whole parts of the fuselage. This indicated that the destruction had occurred in the air, even before it made contact with the ground. The investigation began immediately. In India, such disasters have always been a matter of national importance, and this time the scale of the tragedy shocked the whole world. International experts have also joined the investigation. The picture was developing gradually. The dispatcher's radars recorded that the Il-76 was supposed to hold echelon 150, and the Boeing 747 was supposed to hold echelon 140. The difference of 1,000 feet was supposed to guarantee safety. But the reporting negotiations showed that the Kazakh crew reported reaching flight level 150, while the plane actually continued to descend. Why did this happen? The main factor was a misunderstanding of the English language. Radio operator Igor Rep had difficulty with the accent of the Indian dispatcher. In conditions of a busy broadcast, this led to confusion. His reports did not always reflect the actual altitude, and the dispatcher took them for the truth, without being able to double-check. The second factor is the inconsistency of actions in the Il-76 cabin. The co-pilot, having decided that the dispatcher had allowed the descent to level 140, continued to pull the car down. Commander Chirpanov did not interfere, trusting his colleague. The navigator, whose duty it is to control the altitude, did not react in any way. It turned out that the whole crew made a mistake, which grew like a snowball. The third factor was technical. Neither the Il-76 nor the Boeing had a TCARS system, an on-board collision avoidance system. This technology was not yet mandatory at that time, although it was already used in developed countries. If it had been installed, both crews would have received clear commands, one to gain altitude, the other to descend. Automation would take over control. But instead, it all depended on the people, their attention, and the accuracy of their speech. Interestingly, the investigation highlighted separately that the dispatcher, Shriv Kadath, acted correctly. His instructions were clear and followed all international rules. He issued trains with a safe difference, warned about oncoming traffic and specified the distance. His guilt was excluded. It turned out that the Il-76 cabin was the key link. But the accusation did not sound like a rebuke to one person. The investigation pointed to a whole range of problems: poor English skills among the crews from the former Soviet Union, lack of discipline within the teams, outdated methods of dispatching control, and lack of modern technology. It all came together at one point. The official conclusion was harsh: the disaster occurred due to an unauthorized descent of the Il-76 below the permitted altitude. But behind this dry formulation, there was a much broader problem. In 1996, there were still areas in the sky where safety rested only on trust and care. The Charkhi Dadri disaster was the largest mid-air collision in the history of aviation. 349 lives were cut short in a matter of seconds. But in aviation, every tragedy becomes a lesson that changes the whole system. The first thing the Indian authorities did was modernize the air traffic control system. New radars capable of showing not only the course, but also the altitude of aircraft began to be installed in the control centers. The controllers no longer had to rely solely on the words of the crew. Now the numbers were displayed directly on the screens. The second change affected the international rules. Since that moment, the use of the TCAR's collision avoidance system has gradually become mandatory for all passenger liners. TARS is an electronic watchman that monitors the airspace around and, in case of a dangerous approach, issues specific commands to the crew: climb, gain altitude, or descend, go down. Automation eliminates ambiguity. One side rises, the other descends, and a collision is avoided. If such a system had been on board the Il-76 and Boeing 747 in 1996, the tragedy most likely would not have happened. But it was this disaster that was the impetus that accelerated its worldwide adoption. The third important lesson was the phraseology of radio exchange. The International Civil Aviation Organization recommended that a specific flight level should no longer be named. Instead of "at level 140, dispatchers should say "below you" or "above you." Everything is done so that the pilot does not accidentally mistake someone else's train for his own. This little detail in phraseology was the result of an analysis of the tragedy in Charkhi Dadri. In addition, attention was drawn to the language barrier. After this disaster, ICAO increased the requirements for English proficiency among pilots and air traffic controllers. A standardized English proficiency test has been introduced, which is mandatory for everyone who goes on the international airwaves. The consequences also affected Kazakhstan Airlines. She found herself under pressure not only from financial lawsuits, but also from reputational blows. The carrier was already in crisis, and the disaster was the final point. 8 years later, the company ceased to exist. But perhaps the main lesson was something else. The disaster showed that there are no small things in aviation. One misunderstood word, one uncoordinated action, one outdated device in the control room, and the whole system collapses. Where there should be absolute trust in technology and people, even the slightest glitch turns into a tragedy. Today, almost 3 decades later, every passenger plane crossing the skies over India and other countries is equipped with TARS. Each control screen shows the actual altitude. Every pilot takes an exam in aviation English. All this is a direct legacy of Charkhi Dadri. And when we look at modern aircraft, which seem to us to be a symbol of reliability, it is worth remembering, behind this reliability there are always stories written with pain and loss. The fireball over India has become one of those stories. He has forever entered the memory of aviation as a reminder of the cost of mistakes and that the rules are written not on paper, but in the sky. On the evening of November 12, 1996, the sky flashed over Charkhi Dadri and disappeared into silence. Hundreds of people, each flying on their own business, home, on a business trip, on a pilgrimage, did not even know that their flights were connected by an invisible line. The two planes that were supposed to pass each other ended up at the same point in space. The tragedy has shown that aviation is not only about technology and technology. These are primarily people. Their attention, their words, their decisions. Even the most experienced crews can have a moment of weakness. Even the most accurate dispatcher can work blindly if he lacks the tools. And it is precisely in this fragility that the danger lies. But at the same time, it is precisely such disasters that change the future. After Charkhi Dadri, new locators, new rules, and new standards of communication appeared. TARS has become mandatory on all airliners, and the level of English among pilots and controllers has become tightly controlled. Now, when we board a plane, we fly in the sky, where invisible systems talk to each other faster and more accurately than humans are capable of. The contrast is simple and scary. The price of progress in aviation is almost always measured in lives. Every safety rule is written by past experience. Every light bulb on the pilot's panel is on because it once cost too much to be missing. And maybe this is the answer to the question that torments many after such tragedies: why remember it over and over again? The answer is simple: not to repeat it. So that the fireball over India would not be followed by a new one. Today, Charkhi Dadri is a quiet town that does not stand out among thousands of similar towns in India. But for aviation, this name has become a symbol. A symbol that heaven requires precision, discipline, and respect. And a reminder that even the shortest mistake on the air can change the fate of hundreds of people. When a passenger buckles his seatbelt and hears the familiar "prepare for takeoff," he rarely thinks about how many stories are hidden behind these words. But aviation keeps them all. And one of the brightest is the fiery sky over Charkhi Dadri in November 1996.